Hello everyone, and first I want to say thank you for the reception for my first video. I was not expecting it to do so well, but I was amazed by all the positive comments and likes it got. If this is the first video from me you're watching though, I am building up a new channel about history, politics, and culture. So if you're interested in those things, do consider subscribing and giving the video a like. Anyway, let's now address how the Magical History Tour moniker came about. You see, I'm a huge fan of the Beatles. Have been for about 10 years. They have a song called Magical Mystery Tour, so I thought I'd nickname the channel from that song. But anyway, you're here to find out how the Beatles impacted American culture. So let's begin by talking about them. Now stop and think for a moment. What musicians are so well known and so important to our culture that they're taught about in American history textbooks? Not many, right? Maybe Louis Armstrong, Elvis Presley. The same applies for athletes. You have to be culturally significant, not just accomplished or talented. And with that in mind, the only guys you probably hear about are Babe Ruth or right here, Jackie Robinson. But in any case, I remember in my 9th grade history textbook seeing my favorite group, the Beatles, included in the mix. Oh, how I was excited. Yes, a British band making its way into an American history textbook. Something tells me they must have been well known in America. Now, before the Beatles became well known in America, we have to address their formative years, which were the 1940s and 50s. And for this, there's a great book on the group called The Beatles, All These Years, Volume 1. Released in 2013. Volumes 2 and 3 have yet to actually be released yet, simply because the author Mark Lewison does that much research. I read all 944 pages of the abridged edition of this book. I know, abridged at almost 1,000 pages. And it tells you a lot about the culture of Great Britain during the 1940s and 50s, so even if you're not a die-hard Beatles fan, it's certainly something interesting to explore the culture of the time period. Two of the Beatles, John Lennon and Ringo Starr, were actually born during the Blitz in 1940. This was a bombing campaign of urban cities carried out by the Nazis as World War II escalated. It targeted London, but it also targeted where the Beatles were from, Liverpool. Paul McCartney and George Harrison, their future bandmates, would be born a few years later, with all four of them having working-class Liverpudlian roots. Before Ringo Starr joined the band, John, Paul, George, and drummer Pete Best made up the group that would play late nights at the Cavern Club in Liverpool, or in a lot more of a scary situation, the Red Light District in Hamburg, Germany. What kind of songs would they play? Well, I mentioned that the Beatles influenced American culture, but for now, it was the other way around. They played lots of their favorite rock and roll records that they got from across the pond. They were heavily influenced by African American musicians like Smokey Robinson and Little Richard. They loved the king of rock, Elvis Presley, and the first song they ever recorded all the way back in 1958 was a cover of Buddy Holly's That'll Be the Day. Take a listen to this moment in history.
'Cause that'll be the day when you make me cry. That'll be the day when you say goodbye. You say you're gonna be, you know it's real life. 'Cause that'll be the day when I die.
It may be a little hard to hear them on that terrible recording technology, but from the start, it was obvious the Beatles had a unique stage presence and charisma that won over audiences, regardless of whether they were playing in Britain or Germany. And oh yeah, about Germany. The Lewison book I mentioned earlier told about how Paul had a protective father, and it seemed awfully odd to be going to a country that Britain had just been at war with 15 years ago. Nevertheless, old James McCartney let his son explore the wild side of Deutschland, and there are plenty of interesting stories from the Beatles' formative years there. George was deported for being underage, as he was only 17. Paul McCartney and Pete Best were also deported for a separate incident as they lit a condom on fire as they left a nightclub. But John Lennon was the greatest maniac of them all. For you see, Lennon had an odd fascination with the Nazis and Hitler. and since he was performing in Germany, one of his onstage antics was to put a comb over his lips as a Hitler mustache, do a Nazi salute, and call his German audience a bunch of Nazis. Apparently they didn't understand what was going on with John's wild ways, and they just sorta ate it up. These stories all represent a sense of youthful rebelliousness that had awakened in the 1950s, and as I'll argue later, this rebelliousness expanded in the 60s, certainly due thanks in part to the Beatles. Now, the 50s were definitely overall a time of conformity. It was a time of moving to the suburbs, having a breadwinner husband, a housewife mother, and living in houses that all looked the same. But the music that had permeated the charts in the 1950s had drastically changed from the start of the decade to the end. Songs at the top of the charts to start the 1950s came from artists like Perry Como, K-Star, Tony Bennett, all singers with smooth voices meant for an adult audience. In terms of African American artists, well, there was Nat King Cole, and his music was certainly excellent, but the smooth sound of his voice appealed more to white audiences. This was not rock and roll yet. But by the end of the decade, during the Beatles' teenage formative years, it was Elvis Presley, Little Richard, Chuck Berry, and Buddy Holly dominating the charts, along with many doo-wop vocal groups. Sure, there were whitewashed, and I mean whitewashed, cover artists like Pat Boone releasing crappy covers of these rock songs, but the Beatles were not interested in that. They were interested in that music that had a backbeat that was very far removed from the music of their parents' day. And so when they came to America for the first time in 1964 with Ringo now in the group, they largely brought that rock and roll style of music with them. When the Beatles first came to America to perform on the Ed Sullivan Show, the country was still in mourning. They had lost President John F. Kennedy to an assassin's bullet less than 3 months earlier. Many of the people who were young at that time, the boomers of that era, described JFK's assassination as a loss of innocence, and so the country was in need of some bright faces that could cheer everyone up. Enter the Beatles, who on February 9th, 1964, performed on Sullivan in front of a TV audience of 73 million people. The British invasion had officially kickstarted, with the Beatles having 3 #1 hits in a row in early 1964 with I Want to Hold Your Hand, She Loves You, and Can't Buy Me Love. The most insane fact about the Beatles during this time is that they held all of the top 5 spots on the Billboard Hot 100 during the week of April 4th, 1964. Beatlemania was indeed a mania, with the audience having a cultish following a la the Swifties of the present day. The Beatles would open the door for other British artists to dominate the American charts, such as Peter and Gordon, The Animals, Manfred Mann, The Kinks, and the Rolling Stones. The Beatles had plenty of fans at this time, and they were not just teenage girls. People who actually knew music inside and out were paying attention, such as journalist William Mann, who famously described the Beatles' 1963 song Not a Second Time as having an Aeolian cadence. Yep, you heard that right. John Lennon would later quip years later saying, "To this day I have no idea what Aeolian cadences are. They sound like exotic birds." The Beatles were admittedly not experts in music theory, they didn't even know how to read music, yet they knew by ear how to write catchy songs. Their harmonies were infectious as they had 3 supremely talented singers, sorry Ringo you weren't one of the 3, often featured together on their songs harmonizing. This Beatles sound inspired more than just a British invasion that had a similar sound. No, it inspired some American copycats. One of the most telling examples is the song Lies by the Knickerbockers. Songwriter Beau Charles said, "We desperately tried to write something that sounded like the British invasion," and listen to their lead vocalist Buddy Randall put on his best John Lennon impression. Here is a clip of the song.
Lies, lies, you're telling me that you'll be true. Lies, lies, that's all I ever get from you. Tears, tears, I shed a million tears for you. Tears, tears, and now you're loving someone new. Someday.
If you weren't a Beatles fan or maybe just casually knew a few Beatles songs, I couldn't blame you at all if you thought that was a Beatles song right there. Now the tune Lies was just a number 20 hit on the charts, but there were other American groups still influenced by the Beatles, even if it's less blatantly obvious, who had bigger hits than the old Knickerbockers did. Take the Byrds, for example. Their beautiful 3-part harmonies are heard on their hit songs Mr. Tambourine Man, 8 Miles High, and my personal favorite, Turn, Turn, Turn. Now they had a more folk sound than the Beatles did, but their influence was obvious on the group. And when the Beatles' sound became more musically complex and mature with the 1965 album Rubber Soul, so too did the American artists who were inspired by the Beatles. It was Rubber Soul that helped inspire Beach Boys leader Brian Wilson to compose his 1966 masterpiece Pet Sounds. Without the Beatles, we really don't have much of the 1960s American musical canon that we would have today. The Beatles didn't just have fans though. Like any ultra-relevant titan of culture, they had haters too. And it started more with hating their music and style, and then it became more personal as a certain famous, or perhaps infamous comment from John Lennon emerged. But we'll get to that. Here's just some snippets of some reviews from 1964. Thank you to the user Assaulted Cracker on Reddit for compiling these. You ready for this? Okay, here we go. The Beatles' vocal quality can be described as hoarsely incoherent with the minimal enunciation necessary to communicate the schematic texts. With their bizarre shrubbery, the Beatles are obviously a press agent's dream combo. Not even their mothers would claim that they sing well, but the hirsute thickets they affect make them rememberable, and they project a certain kittenish charm which drives the immature, shall we say, ape. Don't let the Beatles bother you. If you don't think about them, they'll go away. In a few more years, they'll probably be bald. The Beatles are not merely awful, I would consider it sacrilegious to say anything less than they are god-awful. They are so unbelievably, horribly, so appallingly unmusical, so dogmatically insensitive to the magic of the art that they qualify as crowned heads of anti-music, even as the imposter popes went down in history as anti-popes. You get the idea. Clearly the musical intelligentsia was divided on the Beatles. On one hand you had the lover of Aeolian cadences, on the other you had the many haters. But what may have turned the common folk against the Beatles and truly caused a schism in American culture, well, that would have to be John Lennon mouthing off to an interviewer in March 1966 that the group was more popular than Jesus. In due time, Lennon argued rock and roll would overtake Christianity. Now, old John had to perhaps know his audience a little better. I mean, even in the year 2024, 68% of the American public is Christian, but in 1966, that number was 92%. So John's secular message for a country that clearly wasn't so secular did indeed leave a nasty taste in a lot of people's mouths. Take a look and see how these folks reacted.
This is Tommy Charles. If you, as an American teenager, are offended by statements from a group of foreign singers which strike at the very basis of our existence as God-fearing, patriotic citizens, then we urge you to take your Beatle records, pictures, and souvenirs to the pickup points about to be named, and on the night of the Beatles' appearance in Memphis, August 19th, they will be destroyed in a huge public bonfire at a place to be named soon. Stay tuned to Wacky for further development.
But eventually the more popular than Jesus comment would largely leave the news cycle, and it was around this time that the Beatles stopped touring and focused entirely on crafting their songs from the studio. The new word of the day had become psychedelia, songs that involved their experiments with drugs. You know how I said music had changed drastically from the beginning of the 50s to the end? Well, the Beatles' sound had changed perhaps even more drastically from the years of I Want to Hold Your Hand to Strawberry Fields Forever. And that was only just 3 years. One psychedelic pop song the Beatles released in early 1967 was called Penny Lane. See the confused and, at best, mixed reaction of teenagers who listened to its music video at the time it released.
What did you think of that?
That is great.
What did you think?
I don't like their hair.
Their mustache.
You didn't dig the mustaches, huh? What was your comment?
I don't know, they looked older, and it ruins their image, really.
Hmm? How did you feel?
That was funny.
And you?
I liked it.
They're ugly. Their mustaches were weird.
How about back here?
I think they went out with a twist.
Look like grandfathers or something.
Man?
Looked like somebody's grandfather. But they looked okay.
Looked good.
Interesting.
In any case, American audiences must have still been intrigued by the song as it became a #1 hit. After all, there were some teenagers in that crowd that liked the tune. And as 1967 rolled along, the Beatles would be key figures in what would be known as the Summer of Love. The teenagers on American Bandstand may have found their mustaches off-putting, but the Beatles didn't shave them for their iconic 1967 album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Released on May 26th, it became a defining moment in pop culture. It was the first rock LP to win a Grammy for Album of the Year. Its innovative lyrics and sound inspired the youthful, growing counterculture movement and that 1967 Summer of Love. The album was popular among those who marched against the Vietnam War in the March on the Pentagon that year. Conservatives naturally opposed the album, with Vice President Richard Agnew saying, "The friends in With a Little Help from My Friends referred to drugs." But the album cover itself was perhaps the biggest reflection and commentary on pop culture of them all. Among the many people on the album cover are writer Edgar Allan Poe, singer Bob Dylan, actress Marilyn Monroe, philosopher Karl Marx, and perhaps what caught my attention most as a young teenager, actress Diana Dors. If you remember John Lennon's antics from earlier on, I guess it shouldn't surprise us that he also wanted Adolf Hitler on the cover of Sgt. Pepper to be controversial, but unsurprisingly, the idea was nixed. As the Beatles wrapped up their career together before their breakup, they had one last album that has become a cultural touchstone for America, and that is Abbey Road. It used to be that Sgt. Pepper was considered the finest Beatles album by the critics. In fact, in Rolling Stone's first top 500 albums list, it was #1. It was recognized not only for its impact on music, but of course, its impact on pop culture as well. Nowadays, that title for Best Beatles Album has shifted towards Abbey Road. After all, it is Abbey Road that may contain today's most iconic Beatles song, Here Comes the Sun. That song is the #1 most streamed Beatles tune on Spotify, and it's not even particularly close, coming in at over 1.2 billion streams. Second place is Come Together, also off Abbey Road. And much like with Sgt. Pepper, the album cover for Abbey Road has now become an iconic piece of our culture. American tourists travel to Great Britain just to replicate themselves walking down that iconic street. Heck, I certainly hope to do that one day. I mean, my men's chorus group in high school replicated the picture. It just simply looks awesome. The Beatles would break up perhaps at the peak of their power in 1970, as seen by the excellence of what they accomplished as solo musicians afterwards. But the prevailing attitude among the American public may very well have been, how do we reunite this group? In his song about the innocence of the 50s and 60s called All You Wanna Do Is Dance, Billy Joel sang, "Why don't the Beatles get back together?" This was a line I've sometimes heard my grandpa sing, which I find strange now that two of the Beatles are long dead, but it must have been a line that resonated with him. There was even a somewhat facetious offer from Saturday Night Live producer Lorne Michaels, where he would have given the Beatles a check of merely $3,000 to reunite for a show. And apparently, it very nearly happened. Of course, all hopes for a reunion were dashed when John Lennon was tragically shot in 1980. His assassin was inspired, at least in part, by Lennon's comments about how the group was more popular than Jesus. Just as the assassination of JFK was a loss of innocence for the boomers, the killing of Lennon was a loss of innocence for many that came after them. My mom was a 13-year-old girl at the time and a die-hard Beatles fan. She described it to me as a moment of losing innocence. And yet here we are, almost 44 years after this event, still talking about the Beatles. Technically, the group recently had a #7 pop hit with their last song called Now and Then. How is this all even possible for the group to continue its iconic status into the year 2024? Well, it's because they're still culturally relevant. Why though? I'll give you a few examples. A true measuring stick of American culture is the show The Simpsons. All three Beatles who were alive at the time The Simpsons became a thing, so George, Paul, and Ringo all voiced themselves on the iconic show. And when we measure something for greatness, we often use the Beatles as the example. In 2016, rappers Ray Shremmerd and Gucci Mane released the song Black Beatles, suggesting, well, that they are the black version of the Beatles, I suppose. A bit of a haughty suggestion, though the song did get a Paul McCartney seal of approval. Speaking of songs that got some love for McCartney, the song Blackbird, originally released in 1968 as a nod to the civil rights movement, recently resonated with singer Beyoncé. She used the Beatles' original backing track to create a beautiful cover of the song just this year. This is perhaps the most important part of why the Beatles still have a place in our culture. Their music and their message still resonates with us to this day. Now I can go on and on about the Beatles, but in the interest of time, this is my video essay on the group. Their importance to our culture cannot be understated. So, what do you think of the Beatles' impact on American culture? What is a song or story from the Beatles that sticks out to you? Let me know and I'll see you with a new video next week. Bye bye.